Hello, welcome to By the Book. It's the podcast for women in their second season, navigating reinvention, calling, business, and the sacred transitions of midlife. I'm Johanne Hewlett, and I'll be helping you to build your God-led business with faith, wisdom, and confidence. So let's begin. By the Book. As we continue this January reset, I want to talk about something that quietly shapes a lot of anxiety in Christian women, especially in midlife, even if we don't always have the words for it. It's the assumption that if something is from God, it should work, that obedience should lead to visible progress, that faithfulness should produce measurable results, and that if we're listening well and walking rightly, we should be able to point to outcomes that justify the effort. And when those outcomes don't appear, or they appear slowly, we start to question ourselves. Scripture, however, does not teach us to evaluate faithfulness by outcomes. It teaches us to evaluate it by obedience. Now that distinction, it becomes especially important in our second season, because by now you've lived long enough to know that doing the right thing does not always lead to immediate reward. And yet Scripture never withdraws God's approval from faithful obedience, simply because outcomes were unclear. One of the most stabilising truths in the Bible is that God's commands are not outcome-based. God does not say, obey me as long as it works. He says, follow me, full stop. The weight of success, fruit, and timing always rests with him, never with us. This is why Scripture consistently separates obedience from results. Think about Abraham. He obeyed God long before he saw anything fulfilled. And think about Moses. He obeyed God even when the people misunderstood, they resisted and complained. And also think about the prophets. They were faithful, obedient, and often ignored. None of them were evaluated by outcomes. They were evaluated by faithfulness. Hebrews 11 is often misunderstood because we remember the victories and forget the pattern. Yes, some received what was promised, but the chapter also tells us plainly that others, they did not, and they were still commended, not for achievement or for success, but for their faith. That alone diminishes the idea that obedience must be justified by results. This truth is particularly freeing in midlife because at this stage, many women carry a quiet pressure to make something of what's left, to ensure that effort is worth it, that wisdom is used, and that nothing is wasted. But Scripture, it never asks you to guarantee outcomes. It asks you to walk faithfully in the season that you're in. There is a form of Christianity, it's often subtle, that treats obedience as transactional. If I do the right thing, God will produce the right result. But Scripture does not present God as a vending machine. It presents him, the creator of the universe, as sovereign, which means obedience is not leverage, it is trust. That is why obedience sometimes feels costly, because you're obeying without knowing exactly how things are going to turn out. And that's not a flaw in the system, that is the system. Jesus himself models this. He obeys the Father completely, and he's misunderstood, he's rejected, and he's ultimately crucified. The resurrection doesn't retroactively make the cross easier. It reveals that obedience was never dependent on visible success. If your obedience feels quiet right now, if you're doing what you believe is right without much affirmation, and if the fruit feels slow or hidden or unclear, that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It may mean that you're doing it faithfully. Galatians tells us not to grow weary in doing good, not because results are guaranteed quickly, but because God is faithful to his timing. Your task is obedience. God's task is the rest, the outcome. And confusing those two is always going to lead to anxiety. Now, as we move through this January reset, I want you to release the need to justify your obedience with evidence. You don't need to prove that your faithfulness is working. You need to remain anchored in God's order and trust him with the results. That trust is not passive. It's deeply active because it resists fear. It resists urgency and self-protection. Now, in the next episode, we'll bring all of this together by looking at how Scripture defines fruit, not as noise, speed, or scale, but as what grows naturally from a life aligned with God. And that conversation will help you carry this truth forward with peace. If this episode spoke to you, please download your free daily check-in worksheet. It's a simple morning rhythm that helps you hear God, find clarity, and stay anchored as you step into your second season. And if your heart is stirring and you're feeling called to rebuild your life or business with God, you can now order your copy of my new book, By the Book. It's a beautiful, practical, spirit-led guide for women rising later in life. All the links are in the show notes, along with details of my 2 courses that will walk you through this journey. You can choose the one for the season you're in. Until next time, go faithfully, go boldly, and go by the book.